Parents stole my college fund for sister's high school failures. Now they're my tenants. I, 21 male, am currently a junior in college, while my sister Betty, 19 female, just graduated high school after failing twice before. This whole situation has blown up in ways I never expected, but let me start from the beginning. Growing up, Betty always struggled with academics. From elementary school onward, she had trouble keeping up with her classmates. My parents constantly had to attend parent-teacher meetings because she wouldn't turn in assignments or would disrupt class. They always made excuses for her, saying she was just bored because the material wasn't engaging enough, or that the teachers weren't understanding her learning style. By middle school, things got worse. Betty started skipping classes to hang out with older kids. She would come home late, lie about where she'd been, and throw tantrums when caught. My parents' response? They hired expensive tutors and enrolled her in special programs, convinced that if she just got enough support, she would turn things around. I was the complete opposite. I worked hard, got good grades, and stayed out of trouble. This led to an odd dynamic in our house. Betty got all the attention and resources because she was struggling, while I was left to handle everything on my own because I was the responsible one. When I won academic awards or made the honor roll, my parents would barely acknowledge it. But if Betty managed to pass a single test, they would throw a celebration dinner. High school was when things really went downhill. Betty failed her freshman year because she skipped too many classes. Instead of making her face consequences, my parents pulled her out of public school and enrolled her in an expensive private school. They said the smaller class sizes would help her focus. 6 months later, she got expelled after getting caught with drugs in her locker. My parents then spent a fortune on addiction counseling and another private school. She failed again. Each time, they poured more money into fixing her problems, special tutors, educational consultants, summer programs, you name it. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs to pay for my own car insurance and school activities because there was never enough money left for my needs. Despite all this, I managed to get into a good college. My parents agreed to pay for my education, though they never mentioned where the money was coming from. I assumed they had saved up over the years, and I was grateful they were willing to support my education despite spending so much on Betty. Now, 3 years into college, with just 2 years left to graduate, my parents suddenly called me home for dinner last week. They tried to act normal throughout the meal, but I could tell something was off. My mom kept giving me these weird looks, and my dad seemed unusually quiet. After dinner, they dropped the bomb. They couldn't afford to pay for my college anymore because Betty was finally going to college too. They said they needed to focus their resources on her education since she needed more support than me. My mom went on about how proud they were that Betty had finally graduated high school and how they couldn't risk her dropping out of college by making her pay her own way. I was shocked. When I asked if they would expect Betty to pay for her own education after 2 years like they were asking me to do, they avoided answering. My mom just kept repeating how Betty needed extra support and might drop out if they didn't fully fund her education. My dad added that since I was doing so well, I could handle this challenge. The worst part? They suggested I take a year off to work and save money. They acted like delaying my graduation by a year was no big deal. When I tried explaining how this would affect my career plans, I had already lined up an internship for next summer that required me to be enrolled full-time. They dismissed my concerns. My dad even said I was being selfish for not understanding Betty's needs. I was devastated. My part-time job at the campus library barely covered my living expenses. The thought of taking out massive loans or dropping out was terrifying. I had worked so hard to maintain my GPA and was on track to graduate with honors. Now all of that was at risk because my parents decided at the last minute that they couldn't support both of us. I spent the next few days in a fog of stress and anxiety. I looked into loans, but with no credit history and no cosigner, since my parents refused, the interest rates were astronomical. I considered transferring to a cheaper school, but I would lose most of my credits and have to start over. Then I remembered my maternal grandparents. They lived a few hours away and had always been supportive of both me and Betty. They were well off, they had paid for both my parents' college educations and had helped us out financially several times over the years. I decided to visit them and ask for help. I felt terrible about having to ask for money, but I was desperate. When I arrived at their house, I explained my situation, how my parents had suddenly cut off my college funding and suggested I take a year off. That's when my grandmother looked confused and asked why I needed money when they had already set up college funds for both me and Betty years ago. This was completely news to me. Apparently, when I turned 18, they had given my parents 2 separate college funds, one for each of us. The funds were specifically designated for our college education and had more than enough money to cover 4 years each. I was stunned. My parents had never mentioned these funds. I immediately called my mom on speakerphone and asked her about it. She got defensive and claimed there was no specific college fund for me, just general family money. But my grandfather interrupted and firmly stated that he had been very clear about the purpose of those funds when he gave them to my parents. My mom started stammering about needing to talk to Dad about finances and hung up. Later, she sent me angry texts about going behind her back to talk to my grandparents and accused me of trying to cause problems in the family. My grandparents were furious. They demanded answers from my parents about what happened to my college fund. We drove to my parents' house together for a confrontation. Am I wrong for involving my grandparents and potentially causing major family drama? I just wanted to continue my education without going into massive debt. But now I'm worried that I've started something that can't be fixed. Update 1. The confrontation with my parents revealed far more disturbing truths than I was prepared for. When we arrived at their house that evening, my normally calm grandfather didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He pulled out a thick folder of financial documents and demanded to know what happened to my college fund. My parents tried to act confused at first, but my grandfather had come prepared. He had documentation showing exactly how much money he had given them, over $120,000 for my education alone. It was more than enough to cover 4 years at my current university, including room and board. He had similar documentation for Betty's fund. My mother started crying, claiming they had done what they thought was best for the family. My father tried to deflect, saying college costs had increased more than they expected. But my grandfather wouldn't let them dodge the question. He went through his records, showing the exact dates and amounts of money he had transferred to them, demanding they explain where it had all gone. Finally, under the pressure of my grandparents' questioning, the truth started coming out. My mother admitted they had started using my college fund years ago, when Betty first started having problems in high school. Every time she failed, they dipped into my fund to pay for her remedial programs. The list of expenses was staggering. They had spent $30,000 on her first private school after she failed freshman year. Another $25,000 went to the second private school after she got expelled from the first one. They paid $15,000 for a year of private tutoring. $10,000 for a wilderness therapy program when she was caught with drugs. $8,000 for an educational consultant who specialized in troubled teens. But it wasn't just educational expenses. They had bought Betty a brand new car last year, $25,000, to motivate her to finish high school. They got her the latest iPhone and MacBook, $3,000 combined, because her old ones were distracting her from studying. They even paid for her to attend a summer program in Europe, $7,000, that was supposed to help her find herself. What made it worse was learning that Betty's college fund was still completely untouched. When I suggested using her fund to pay for my remaining semester since they had used my money on her, my dad refused outright. He said I was the mature and responsible child who could handle challenges, while Betty needed all the support she could get to succeed in college. My mom tried to justify their actions by saying they always intended to replace the money they took from my fund. But when my grandfather asked how they planned to do that when they had just told me they couldn't afford my tuition anymore, she had no answer. The most infuriating revelation came when my grandmother asked about a recent large withdrawal from what was left of my fund. My parents got very quiet. After some pressure, they admitted they had just spent $12,000 to send Betty on a luxury vacation to Hawaii with her friends. They said she needed to de-stress after finally graduating high school and deserved a reward for her accomplishment. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. While I was having panic attacks about potentially having to drop out of college, they had used what was left of my college fund to send my sister on a fancy vacation. A sister who had failed high school 3 times and was now being rewarded for finally doing what she was supposed to do. My grandparents were beyond livid. Not just about the misuse of the college fund, but because they had also gifted my parents our family home 2 years ago. The house had been in my grandfather's name, but he signed it over to them as a gift. He had done this specifically to help them focus on providing for their children's education without having to worry about housing costs. Finding out that they had squandered my education fund while living in a house he had given them was the last straw for my grandfather. He announced that he would be meeting with his lawyer first thing Monday morning to transfer the house deed to my name. He said my parents could either move out, or they could start paying me rent, which I could use for my remaining college expenses. My parents tried to argue that they had done what was best for the family. My dad insisted that supporting Betty through her struggles was necessary and that I should understand since I was her brother. My mom cried about how they were just trying to be good parents to both of us. But my grandparents weren't having any of it. My grandmother pointed out that they hadn't just stolen from me, they had betrayed her and my grandfather's trust. They had taken money specifically designated for my education and used it to enable Betty's behavior instead of making her face consequences. My father tried one last time to justify their actions, saying they couldn't let Betty fail again. My grandfather shut him down immediately, pointing out that by protecting Betty from consequences, they had stolen my future opportunities instead. He told them they had failed not just as parents to me, but as children who had betrayed their own parents' trust. I left my parents' house that night with my head spinning. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal was hard to process. It wasn't just about the money, it was about how little they had valued my future compared to protecting Betty from her own mistakes. My parents have been blowing up my phone since then, alternating between angry messages about how I've betrayed them by involving my grandparents, and pleading messages asking me to understand their position. They keep saying they just wanted to help both their children succeed, but all I can think about is how they were willing to sacrifice my success to protect Betty from failure. My grandfather has already contacted his lawyer about transferring the house deed. He says it should be done within a week. I never wanted things to go this far, but I also can't deny feeling a sense of justice. After years of putting Betty's needs before mine, my parents are finally facing consequences for their choices. The most surreal part? Betty is still in Hawaii, completely unaware of everything that's happened. She has no idea that her luxury vacation was paid for with the last of my college fund, or that our parents' lies have finally caught up with them. I'm dreading the moment she comes back and finds out everything that's happened, but I'm done protecting her from the truth. Update 2. Things have gotten even more intense since my last update. The house deed has officially been transferred to my name, just as my grandfather promised. I gave my parents an ultimatum, either start paying market rate rent, $2,000 per month, or move out within 30 days. They chose to stay and pay rent, but they're doing everything possible to make my life miserable. They've been calling every family member they can reach, telling them how their ungrateful son is forcing them to pay rent for their own house. Of course, they conveniently leave out the part about stealing my college fund and lying about it for years. My aunt called me yesterday, telling me I was being cruel to my own parents. When I explained the full story about the college fund, she went quiet and quickly ended the call. But here's where things get even more twisted. Yesterday, I was helping my parents organize some paperwork. Part of the new rental agreement requires them to keep their documents in order, and I found something shocking. There weren't any college application documents or acceptance letters for Betty. Nothing. Not a single piece of paper suggesting she had applied anywhere. I confronted my parents about this, and after some back and forth, the truth came out. Betty hasn't actually applied to any colleges yet. Their whole story about needing to stop paying my tuition because they had to pay for her college was a complete lie. They made up the story because they had almost completely drained my college fund and needed an excuse to stop paying my tuition. The real plan? They were going to use what little was left of my fund to help Betty figure out her future, which apparently meant more shopping sprees and vacations while she found herself. They thought they could stretch out the remaining money for a few more months while Betty decided what she wanted to do with her life. But that's not even the worst part. While going through their financial records, which I now have a right to see as their landlord, I found old bank statements showing they had been using my college fund for years to pay for family vacations. Vacations I was never invited to because I was too busy with studies or needed to focus on school. They took trips to the Bahamas, went on Alaskan cruises, and even spent a month touring Europe, all with money that was supposed to be for my education. Each time, they told me they couldn't afford to take me along and that I needed to stay focused on my academics anyway. Now I know they could afford it, they just chose to spend my college fund on themselves and Betty instead. When Betty finally returned from her Hawaii trip, she was initially furious about the new rental situation. But then I sat her down and showed her all the documentation, the original college fund statements, the bank transfers, everything. I showed her how our parents had spent my entire college fund on her extra schooling, her car, her phones, and yes, even her recent Hawaii trip. Instead of defending our parents like they probably expected, Betty was horrified. She had no idea where all the money for her expenses had been coming from. She broke down crying when she realized her luxury vacation had been paid for with the last of my college money. She was especially upset because she said she wouldn't have even gone on the trip if she had known the truth. Betty confronted our parents that same night. She demanded to know why they never told her they were using my college fund for her expenses. Their response? They said they didn't want her to feel guilty or responsible for their financial decisions. They thought if she knew the truth, it might affect her self-esteem and make her give up on education entirely. Betty was furious. She told them she would rather have known the truth than live in ignorance while they stole from her brother. She's now refusing to accept any money from them for college, saying she'll work and save up first. She even offered to sell the car they bought her to help pay for my tuition, though I told her to keep it since selling it wouldn't make much difference now. The most ironic part? Our parents are now accusing me of turning Betty against them. They say I've poisoned her mind with half-truths and misrepresentations of their decisions. But Betty has seen the documentation herself. She knows exactly what they did and why they did it. My parents are now stuck paying rent to their own son, watching their plans fall apart, and dealing with both their children being angry with them. They made their choices thinking they could keep manipulating the situation forever. Now they're facing the consequences, and they don't like it one bit. Update 3. A lot has happened since my last update. My parents finally moved out last week, unable to handle the humiliation of paying rent to their own son. They found a small 2-bedroom apartment across town. The day they moved out was tense, to say the least. While loading the last of their belongings into the moving truck, my mom tried one final guilt trip. She cornered me in the kitchen, tears streaming down her face, saying I was punishing them for being good parents who just wanted to help their struggling child. She went on about how parents are supposed to make sacrifices for their children, and how I was being selfish for not understanding that Betty needed more support than I did. I finally lost my patience. I reminded her that they hadn't just stolen from me, they had betrayed my grandparents' trust too. They had multiple chances to come clean about the college fund, but instead, they chose to lie until they were caught. I pointed out how they had no problem watching me stress about potentially dropping out of college while they were spending my money on vacations and luxury items for themselves and Betty. My dad then jumped in, trying to defend their actions by saying they always intended to pay the money back. When I asked him how they planned to do that when they couldn't even afford an apartment in our neighborhood anymore, he had no answer. He just mumbled something about me being ungrateful for all the sacrifices they had made. The most surprising part of moving day was when they tried to take some of my grandparents' antique furniture, pieces that had been in the family for generations. They claimed these items were family heirlooms that should go with them. Fortunately, my grandfather had anticipated this and had already given me documentation proving these pieces were meant to stay with the house. When I showed them the papers, they finally backed down, but not before my mom accused me of stealing their heritage. My grandparents have been incredibly supportive through all of this. They helped me set up a payment plan with my college's financial aid office. Between the rent I'm now collecting from leasing out my parents' old room to a graduate student, $800 per month, and my part-time job at the library, I should be able to graduate without taking out any loans. My grandfather even helped me set up a proper lease agreement for the new tenant. The most satisfying development? Some of my parents' friends who initially sided with them have started reaching out to apologize. Apparently, my parents had been telling everyone that I cruelly evicted them without cause. But when these friends learned about the stolen college fund and all the lies, many of them changed their tune. A few have even offered to help me with job connections after graduation. Betty has been staying with me since our parents moved out. She's working full-time at a local restaurant and taking classes at the community college in the evenings. She's determined to pay her own way and not touch the college fund our parents still have for her. She says she couldn't enjoy that money knowing what they did with mine. The hardest part of all this has been realizing that our parents still don't truly understand what they did wrong. In their minds, they were just being good parents to Betty. They can't seem to grasp that being a good parent to one child doesn't mean you get to steal from the other. Their last text message to me was about how they hope someday I'll understand that parents have to make difficult choices for their children. But I do understand difficult choices. I understood when I had to choose between maintaining peace in the family and standing up for what was right. I understood when I had to choose between letting my parents continue living in their fantasy world and holding them accountable for their actions. Those were difficult choices too, but unlike them, I made my choices without stealing from anyone. Update 4. Life has finally settled into a new normal, though it's very different from what I ever imagined. I'm focusing on finishing my last year of college while managing the house. The graduate student renting my parents' old room is working out great. She's quiet, pays rent on time, and sometimes even helps Betty with her community college assignments. Betty has completely transformed from the troubled teenager our parents enabled into a responsible young adult. She's working full-time at an upscale restaurant where she started as a server but recently got promoted to shift supervisor. She takes community college classes in the evenings and maintains a 3.8 GPA, all while paying her own way. It turns out she was capable of much more than our parents ever gave her credit for. The biggest change? Betty recently sold the car our parents bought her with my college fund. Despite my objections, she insisted on giving me the money. She said she couldn't keep driving around in a car that represented how our parents had stolen from me. She now drives a used Honda she bought with her own savings, and she's proud of it. Our parents still try to contact us, usually with a mix of guilt-tripping and demands. Last week, they showed up unannounced, complaining about how their apartment is too small and how they can't afford to retire now that they're paying rent. They demanded we give them another chance, saying they've learned their lesson. But their idea of learning their lesson seems to be offering to pay me back $100 a month from my stolen college fund, which would take over 50 years to repay. The most laughable part? They're still trying to manipulate the situation. They told extended family that they're living in a cramped apartment because their ungrateful son took their house. When my aunt visited them recently, she was shocked to find they're actually in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in a nice area. They're just bitter it's not as luxurious as their old house. My grandparents have become even more involved in our lives. They visit every Sunday for dinner, and my grandmother is teaching Betty to cook family recipes, something our mom never bothered to do. My grandfather has been mentoring me on property management and investment, ensuring I'm handling the house and my finances responsibly. The most surprising development has been Betty's college fund. Since she's paying for community college herself, our parents tried to use her fund for themselves. My grandparents shut that down immediately. They've now set up a trust in Betty's name that our parents can't touch. Betty can only access it for educational expenses, and she's determined to save it for when she transfers to a 4-year university. As for me, I'm set to graduate next spring with honors. The company where I did my internship has already offered me a full-time position after graduation. It's ironic, our parents' actions were supposed to derail my education, but instead, they've made me more determined to succeed. This whole experience taught me that sometimes the people who should support you the most are the ones who let you down. But it also showed me that standing up for yourself, even against family, isn't wrong when you're fighting for what's right. Betty and I have built a stronger relationship without our parents' toxic influence, and we've learned we can rely on each other. Our parents made their choices, prioritizing one child while stealing from the other, and now they have to live with the consequences. As for Betty and me, we're doing just fine without them.